I'm sharing with Deputy Mick Wallace.
Okay.
Well, as Deputy Boyd Barrett said, of course, the Housing Building Finance Ireland Home Building Finance Ireland Bill, of course, was announced last October in Budget 2018, and we expect it to be functioning and giving out loans, Minister, during this quarter, the end of the last quarter in 2018. Now, you're saying it may be operational at the end of the year. And listen to that, Can, you'd think, of course, there wasn't a housing crisis and there wasn't a need for radical emergency measures. If we take 9 months to do a basic piece of legislation. During my own speech on Budget 2018, before details of the bill emerged, I said at the time that I thought the new Housing Finance Bank planned under the Home Building Finance Ireland seemed to be a very modest and poor response to the many calls for the Minister for Housing to establish a state developer of housing, or a national housing executive, or a state development bank for housing. And based on the bill before us today, unfortunately, I think I was correct at that time. The £750 million fund to be made available to developers who can't get loans elsewhere or can't get enough money elsewhere, as the Minister is saying, is expected to deliver around 6,000 homes. But these presumably are not for-profit homes, Minister. There are no stipulation other than the usual current Part 5 10% that these loans are to provide affordable or social housing. And this is something perhaps we can come back to again at committee stage. Now, while in principle a housing finance bank is welcome, the current proposal, I believe, it seems to be merely carrying on the failed private developer model, the favourite policy of Fine Gael and its Fianna Fáil predecessors. And that's the key critique, I think, of this bill before us today. Minister Owen Murphy spoke yesterday at the launch of the report, The Future of Council Housing, an analysis of the financial sustainability of local authority-provided social housing by Professor Michelle Norris and Senator Aideen Hayden, where the case was clearly made for the need for council housing for low-income families and individuals. And one of the central recommendations of the Hayden and Norris report, which I think we would all support, is that councils should be enabled to raise their own housing finance from property tax, from borrowings, and indeed also to have self-financing planned maintenance of their estates, something they just don't have access to at present. The total dependence of local authorities on government grants for critical social housing development is one of the key reasons, of course, for the dearth of social houses from 2011 to the present day. There are many improvements, of course, which could be made in the provision of council housing, but we first need a large-scale public and affordable home building programme, and indeed new financial arrangements for councils, as I said, to raise and deploy finance for housing. Representatives of developers and builders, such as the CIF, Construction Industry Federation, say developers need access to cash and report that in an access to finance survey which they carried out, 70% of builders who completed that survey said they expect to have difficulty securing finance over the coming 3 years. Yet the pillar banks and other financial institutions have themselves developed funds exclusively for these developers for housing development. Since 2013, for example, AIB has had a £350 million new homes development fund, and a further £100 million social housing development fund was announced in 2017. Also in 2017, Bank of Ireland announced the £1 billion fund for property development. Activate Capital also provides finance for residential development from a £500 million fund. And again, as mentioned earlier, this capital is being made available in the main for profit speculative residential units. And surely it would be better to put such funding, Minister, and the funds under this bill before us today into an emergency public housing programme directed by local authorities or a new housing executive. Section 9 of the bill, of course, provides for the services, systems and staff of HBFI, and it's expected that some of the personnel and expertise of NAMA will be transferred to this new company, and that NAMA staff will be used in delivering the services of HBFI. It's expected, of course, that HBFI will also liaise closely with the Chief Executive of the NTMA. But some will ask, of course, why the Government hasn't simply given a new mandate to NAMA, since HBFI will clearly be the daughter of NAMA as well as of NTMA. NAMA's recently published 2017 annual report, of course, estimates that it will deliver a permanent surplus of up to £3.5 billion. The Government's explanation on the setting up of a new this new bank is that we can't break EU state aid rules, so we're instead using the designated activity company, the DAC format, which is when the company is limited in its functions and is usually an SPV, a special purpose vehicle. But as part of the DAC setup, HBFI will issue shares of 20 million to the Minister for Finance upon incorporation. And the Government argues, as you did earlier, Minister, this is the best way to get around the EU rules, state aid rules. But is the real reason that NAMA, because many of us used to think along those lines several years ago, it's not been entrusted with this task and fund, Minister, because worrying and pertinent questions have been asked about NAMA's track record, for example, with Project Eagle and so on. In fact, Fine Gael and Labour are responsible for directing NAMA's policy since 2011, and Minister Noonan directed NAMA to dispose of huge assets as early as possible, meaning that it's estimated that between perhaps 20 billion and 30 billion of Irish assets have been effectively lost to the Exchequer. My colleague Deputy Wallace, of course, has rightly consistently criticised the Government and NAMA for this approach, and Frank Connolly's, the distinguished journalist Frank Connolly's book, NAMA Land, raises a number of disturbing questions. But it's actually, of course, the political masters of NAMA who must take the blame for the estimated huge loss to our state, and in particular Minister Noonan. So continuation of the failed, far too slow housing policy of this Government as a modus operandi now in the establishment of HBFI is deplorable. And meanwhile, of course, Cancorla, households and people on social housing waiting lists and in homelessness, they go on suffering day after day, and we get desperate phone calls hour after hour from people who maybe have been 2 years, just like this afternoon, Minister, 2 years in homeless accommodation and desperately wanting some kind of stable accommodation for their children. And then we've had the misrepresentation by the Housing Department of key statistics, telling us that 30,000 plus more homes were actually built than were built, in the period 2011 to 2017. And we've seen ferocious rent rises, of course, over the past. No serious rent control. The 4% rule simply not working. House prices exploding down through the years, and little or no chance for younger savers. So the Government have presided over a litany of failures. Even the so-called affordable housing scheme has also been a failure, and now we have this other development which really won't the HBFI, which won't seriously or urgently address our huge housing debt. And it's hoped, of course, that HBFI will contribute another 10 to 13% of the housing stock needed. This might mean at least 2,000 or 3,000 units per annum. But the belated appearance of this bill, while its significance, is sadly the same old approach. One glaring omission I noticed in your speech, Minister, and in discussions we've had today about it, I listened to some of those speeches from the chair there, is any information on how interest rates will be calculated, what they'd be linked to, or what's the loan-to-cost rate. AIB and BOI's interest rates are around 7%, and loan-to-cost ratios of around 60–65%. Activate Capital's interest rates are around 10%, with a loan-to-cost ratio of 90%. Deputy Broughan, of course, spoke of 30–35% of housing financially sourced internationally, which are huge interest rates. And the Minister you've said that again and again in your speech that the loans will be sourced at commercial rates, but you've really given us no further information, and perhaps you might come back to that. On the positive side, of course, like others, I welcome the fact that the new body, HBFI, will be accountable to the Controller and Auditor General and to the Public Accounts Committee, and also, of course, that there will be protection for whistleblowers and the communication between the organisation and outsiders, that it will be managed in a way that we don't have repetition of the serious allegation about NAMA. So I don't believe, Minister, that HBFI, it won't deliver what we desperately need tonight and every night since this housing crisis got so dire 4 or 5 years ago, maybe 7 years ago. The vehicle in front of us is just not going to do the job that we need to rebuild this country and to provide the homes we need. Thanks, Can.